Edouard Valcourt had perfected the art of the table. Not just any table. The one in the far corner of Maison Claire, his restaurant on the quieter end of Kensington, round, intimate, lit by a single candle that burned low enough to be romantic but high enough that he could see everything. He could read a woman's posture before she sat down. He could tell in the first 4 seconds whether she was nervous or comfortable, whether she had dressed for him or for herself, whether she was going to say what she thought or what she imagined he wanted to hear. He had been doing this for 2 years. 30 women, 30 evenings, 30 careful conversations that looked from the outside like dates. They were not dates. He arrived 10 minutes early that evening, as he always did. The maitre d', a quiet man named Felix who had worked for him for 7 years, brought him his usual sparkling water, a thin slice of lemon, no ice. Edouard sat with his back to the wall and his eyes on the door and waited. Her name was Caroline. She had a friend who knew a colleague who had mentioned his name. This was how most of them arrived, through a soft chain of social connections, each link innocent, none of them aware of what they were connecting someone to. Caroline walked in at 8 minutes past the hour. She was wearing a dark green coat, and she did not look around the room nervously the way some of them did. She caught Felix's eye, said something, and followed him without looking down at her phone or adjusting her hair. Edouard noted this. It meant either genuine confidence or practiced composure. He had not yet determined which was more interesting. She was pretty in the way that well-rested, well-organized women are pretty, not constructed, just assembled carefully. She smiled when she saw him rise from the table, and the smile was the real kind, the kind that started at the eyes. He distrusted it immediately. Not because he thought she was insincere, but because sincerity, in his experience, was almost always the first disguise. "I'm sorry I'm late," she said, sitting down. The tube was cruel. "It always is," he said, and poured her water and smiled and began. The first question was always simple. Where did you grow up? Easy enough to answer, impossible to lie about. Well, he was not listening for the answer. He was listening for the rhythm of it, whether she moved through it comfortably or whether she edited herself as she spoke, choosing words slightly too carefully, sculpting the story as it left her mouth. Caroline said she had grown up in Norwich. She described it without romance, grey skies, good chips, a family who was loud at Christmas. She didn't make it sound better than it was. He gave her a mental point for that. "Do you miss it?" he asked. "Some days," she said. "Mostly I miss the chips." He smiled, she smiled back. The candle made shadows on the tablecloth. The food arrived, Dover sole for her, lamb for him, and the conversation moved into its second phase, which was where he deployed what he privately called the comfort questions. These were the ones designed to make a woman feel seen, to make her lean forward slightly, to make her feel the dinner was less about finding out if they were compatible and more about being genuinely understood. He was very good at them. "What do you find yourself thinking about when you can't sleep?" he asked. Caroline tilted her head. "Whether I made the right choices," she said, then, which is probably what everyone says. "Not everyone," he said, and he meant it. Most of them said work or money or someone they had not called in too long. She asked about his work. He ran 3 restaurants, a wine import business, and a small foundation that funded culinary training for young people from disadvantaged backgrounds. He described all of it briefly and without inflation. This was another part of his method. He never oversold himself. Overselling invited a woman to match him, and matching was performance, and performance obscured the thing he was actually looking for. He was looking for the crack. Every person has a crack, a place in the conversation where the constructed version of themselves fails to hold and something rawer comes through. For some women it came early with the second glass of wine. For others it took most of the evening to surface. He had learned to be patient. With Caroline, the crack came between the main course and the dessert menu. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Of course. Are you actually interested in me, or is this something you do? The dinner, the questions, she gestured vaguely at the room, at him, at the whole architecture of the evening. "You're very good at this. That can mean 2 things. He held her gaze. He allowed a beat of silence. "What are the 2 things?" he asked. She looked at him steadily. "That you're genuinely curious about people, or that you're very practiced at making people feel like you are." He said, "Those might not be mutually exclusive." She nodded slowly. "That's a very good answer," she said. "It's also not an answer." He poured more water. He said that he had found most conversations were better when they moved slowly. She said she preferred honesty to atmosphere. He told her he respected that. She said thank you. The dessert menu came. She ordered the chocolate tart. He ordered nothing. The evening ended warmly, politely, without tension. In the car home, he wrote in his notebook, a slim, dark green leather thing he kept in his jacket pocket. Caroline Norwich, self-aware, pressed for honesty, did not wait for invitation, edited mid-sentence 3 times. Verdict, she showed me what she wanted me to see, nothing I did not expect. He closed the notebook. 30 women, that was how many it had taken. Or rather, that was how many he had reached before he understood the pattern was not in them. But he was not there yet. He was at woman number 1. He needed to go back further, before Caroline, before the notebook, before the restaurant in Kensington and the practice questions and the 2 years of careful evenings. He needed to go back to where it started, which was not a restaurant at all. It was a Tuesday afternoon in February, in a solicitor's office on the 4th floor of a building near Holborn, where a woman named Catherine told him that the investment she had made with his money, £430,000 that he had trusted her with entirely, had never existed. He had met Catherine at a charity gala. She had been warm, intelligent, funny in the dry way he admired. They had talked for 3 hours at a table near the window. She had seemed, and this was the word he returned to again and again in the months that followed, she had seemed completely real. The money was gone, the woman was gone. The solicitor explained the process with professional sympathy, and Edward sat in the chair and heard nothing after the second sentence, because his mind was doing something he had never felt before, which was processing not the financial loss but the other one. He had believed her. Completely, without reservation. He had looked at her across a table just like the one at Mason Clare, and he had thought, this person is exactly who she appears to be. And he had been wrong in a way that humiliated him, not because he was a fool, he was not a fool, but because he was a man who trusted his own judgment. His judgment had been the one thing he was certain of. He recovered the money eventually, through lawyers, through patience, through a process that took 14 months. But the recovery was not the point. The point was that he had sat across from a woman and seen only what she had constructed for him to see. And so he decided to understand it. Not to punish anyone, not to find the template of the lie so he could protect himself from it again, although that was part of it, he admitted to himself in honest moments. Mostly he wanted to understand how it worked, how a person became unknowable, how a face could be presented and another face hidden entirely behind it. He started with people he knew slightly, then with acquaintances, then with strangers, then it became the dinner, the table, the notebook, the questions. What he discovered over those first 3 months was that he was very good at reading people. He could identify the small signals, a pause that lasted 1 beat too long, a detail that changed slightly on retelling, an answer that arrived too quickly to have been genuinely considered. He wrote these observations down. He built a vocabulary for it. What he did not discover in those first 3 months was the thing he was actually looking for. He told himself this was because he had not found the right sample. He needed more data. He needed to sit across from more people, ask more questions, give the process more time. What he did not tell himself, because he was not yet ready to hear it, was that he was no longer sure what he was looking for. That the thing driving him was no longer curiosity or even a desire to understand. That it had become something else, something that felt very much like needing to be right about something that he could not name. He kept going. The women came through the soft chain of social connection always. He never engineered the meetings artificially. He attended events he would have attended anyway, gallery openings, charity dinners, industry evenings. He was invited to things. He was, by any observable measure, a perfectly pleasant and interesting man, and women found him engaging company. He found this useful. Each one sat across the table from him and he gave her his full attention and he asked his questions and he listened, really listened, in a way that most people never experienced, and he watched for the crack, and he wrote in his notebook and he drove home. Woman number 4 was a doctor. She was brilliant, genuinely funny, and spent the entire evening being slightly more impressive than she needed to be. He noted the effort. Woman number 7 wept briefly in the middle of describing her previous relationship. The tears were real. She apologized. He said there was nothing to apologize for. He meant it. He wrote that night the emotion was authentic, but she showed it to make me trust her more, still strategy. Woman number 12 had been the closest to something he could not fully annotate. She was a teacher. She had grown up in Scotland. She laughed too loudly and didn't seem to care. She said things that surprised him. At the end of the evening, she told him plainly that she had enjoyed herself and that she was not looking for anything complicated. He wrote honest possibly, cannot confirm, need more data. He did not call her again. He told himself this was methodological discipline. By the time he reached woman number 20, something had shifted in him that he did not have a good word for. He was still precise. He was still attentive. His questions were better than ever. But there was a weight to the evenings now, something that sat behind his eyes through each dinner. A woman named Helen, 22nd in the sequence, said something to him near the end of a long evening that stayed with him. She said, "You're the most interesting man I've ever been bored by." He asked her to explain. She shook her head and smiled, and he saw that she found it funny but also meant it, and the combination of those two things was something he had no category for. He drove home and opened the notebook and sat for 20 minutes without writing anything. He told himself the pattern would emerge. He had been wrong about people before, wrong about Catherine in the most costly way possible, and understanding how that happened required patience and data and continued observation. He was building something. The picture would come clear. He reached 30. Caroline was 30, the woman in the dark green coat who had asked him outright whether he was genuinely curious or just practiced at appearing to be. He had not answered her honestly. He had given her the clever answer, the one that was true and also evasive at the same time. He drove home from that dinner and wrote in the notebook and closed it and sat in the dark of his study and allowed himself, for the first time in 2 years, a question he had been avoiding. What are you actually trying to find? He did not answer it that night. He put the notebook on the shelf and poured a small glass of whiskey and went to stand at the window. The street below was quiet. A fox crossed under a lamppost and disappeared. He thought about Catherine and the solicitor's office and the £430,000 that had turned out to be nothing. And he thought about the way he had sat in that chair and felt the world rearrange itself around a single fact. And he thought about all 30 women and their 30 evenings and the notebook full of annotations and small verdicts. And he thought, I have been asking the wrong people. He was not sure yet what the right question was. He was not sure who the right person was. But for the first time in 2 years, he understood that what he had been doing was not research. It was something else. He just did not know the word for it yet. The notebook sat on the shelf. The whiskey sat untouched on the side table. The fox did not return. And Edward Valcourt stood at the window of his study on a quiet Wednesday night, 2 years and 30 women deep into something he had never once properly named, and felt, for the first time since that Tuesday afternoon in Holborn, genuinely uncertain. He did not sleep well. He did not expect to. He was wrong about 30 women, not about them specifically. He had been right about most of his individual observations. He was wrong about the project. He was wrong about what it was for. He understood this clearly in the morning, standing at the kitchen counter with a cup of black coffee, watching the early light come through the garden window. He had 2 options. He could stop, close the notebook, call Caroline or Helen or the Scottish teacher whose loud laugh he kept remembering and say something. He could re-enter the world as a person rather than an observer. Or he could continue, one more evening, one more question, but this time, and this was new, this was the part he had not planned, without the notebook, without the method, without the questions he had spent 2 years sharpening into small, elegant instruments of detection. Just himself across a table without armor. He thought about this for a long time. Then he finished his coffee, went upstairs, put on his jacket, and called Felix to ask whether the corner table at Mason Clare was free the following Thursday. It was. He had someone in mind. He just did not know yet how completely she was going to change everything. Her name was Marguerite. He did not know that yet either. But the day was coming, and when it did, it would not arrive quietly. Nothing about Marguerite Osei ever did. The call came on a Thursday morning, from a man named Patrick who was the kind of person who knew everyone and felt no hesitation about connecting them. Patrick rang Edward at 9:30 while Edward was reviewing supplier contracts at his desk, and without preamble said, "There's someone you should meet." Edward said nothing for a moment. He had heard this before. He had, in fact, structured the last 2 years around hearing this. "Who?" he said. "Her name is Marguerite," Patrick said. "She works in architecture. She's here from Lagos for 6 months. She's designing the interior fit-out for the new arts complex near Southbank. She's brilliant and she's terrible at small talk, and you will either find her fascinating or you'll want to end the evening early." "Those are interesting options," Edward said. "Yes," said Patrick. "That's why I'm calling you and not someone boring." They arranged dinner for the following Thursday. Edward thanked Patrick, replaced the phone, and sat for a moment. He had decided the morning after the Caroline dinner that he was going to try one more, without the notebook, without the method. He had not expected it to arrive this quickly. He spent the week before the dinner in a state that he did not recognize immediately. He was not nervous. Nervousness implied uncertainty about performance, and he had no uncertainty about his ability to conduct an evening's conversation. But something was present that had not been there for any of the previous 30, something almost like wariness, as though this time the stakes were different. He asked himself why the stakes felt different. He did not have a clear answer. He told himself it was because he had decided to come without the method, without the practiced questions, without the observation framework, and the absence of his usual tools created a kind of openness that he was not comfortable with. He arrived at Maison Claire at the usual time, 10 minutes early. Felix brought his water. Edward sat with his back to the wall. She was late. Not by much, 11 minutes, but she was late, and she did not apologize when she arrived, and this was the first thing. She came through the door already looking at the room rather than at him. She scanned the space the way he imagined architects looked at spaces, not casually, not decoratively, but with some practical intention behind it. Felix brought her to the table and she sat down and looked at him and said, "Hello." Not, "I'm so sorry I'm late, the traffic was impossible." Not, "You must be Edward, I've heard so much about you." Just, "Hello." "Hello," he said. She picked up the menu. He watched her read it. She did not perform the reading, did not look up at him between lines, did not comment on the options, did not use the menu as a conversational prop the way many people did. She read it, put it down, and said, "The lighting in here is trying too hard." He laughed. He did not plan to. It simply happened, which was something that had not simply happened in a very long time. He caught it a half-second after it left him, this involuntary thing, and he registered its strangeness. She was looking at him steadily. "I'm not trying to be rude about your restaurant," she said. "I just think candles should do one thing, this one is doing about 4. It's supposed to create atmosphere," he said. "It creates effort," she said. "Atmosphere is different." The waiter came. She ordered without deliberating. He ordered the same lamb he always ordered from habit. They were brought bread and water, and she tore a piece of bread and ate it without comment, and he thought, "This is new." He had no opening question prepared. He had spent 2 years perfecting his opening question. He sat across from Marguerite Osai with a glass of sparkling water and absolutely nothing structured to say, and realized, with something that was close to alarm, that this was what it felt like to simply have a conversation. He started with the work. "Patrick tells me you're designing the interior for the Southbank complex," he said. "The conceptual framework," she said. "The actual interior fit-out is a team. People think architects work alone, they don't. Do you wish they did?" She looked at him. It was a direct look, not hostile, just precise. "Sometimes," she said. "But the best ideas come from friction. You need people who disagree with you, otherwise you're just refining your own habits." He thought about the notebook, the 2 years of systematic refinement of his own habits. "What happens when the disagreement stops being productive?" he asked. "You're not asking about architecture," she said. It was not a question. He paused. He was not used to being read. "No," he said after a moment, "I'm not." She nodded as though this confirmed something. "Most conversations that start with work are really about something else," she said. "The work is just the address." He was quiet. He looked at her. She was not particularly concerned with whether he was comfortable. He had spent 2 years with women who were, in various degrees, attuned to his comfort, whether he was engaged, whether the conversation was going well, whether they were giving him what he seemed to want. Marguerite did not appear to give this any thought at all. He found this almost unbearably interesting. The main course arrived. She ate with focus. She did not seem to find silences awkward. He, who had used silences as instruments for his entire adult life, found himself in the unfamiliar position of filling one. "What made you come to London?" he asked. "The project," she said. "It's a good project." "Just the project." She put her fork down for a moment and looked at him. "Yes," she said simply. "Is that surprising?" "Most people have more than one reason for uprooting themselves," he said. "Most people do most things for more than one reason," she said. "But if you ask me what brought me here, the honest answer is the work. I followed the work, I do that." He looked at her. "You say honest like it's a position," he said. "It is," she said, and picked up her fork again. He asked somewhere in the middle of the second course the question about what she found herself thinking about when she could not sleep. This was his second question, the one he deployed to create intimacy, to make the woman feel seen. He asked it carefully from habit, and then caught himself asking it and felt slightly wrong about it. She looked at him for a moment. "Structural problems," she said. "Load-bearing calculations that don't sit right. Why?" "Most people say something more personal," he said. "Most people answer the question they wish you'd asked," she said. "You asked what I actually think about, I told you." He put his glass down. He had asked that question to 23 women. 23 women had given him answers that were slightly too shaped, slightly too revealing in a way that felt intentional, slightly too emotional to be entirely spontaneous. He had annotated all 23 answers in the notebook. Marguerite had answered the question he asked. It was such a simple thing, he did not know why it stopped him. "Can I ask you something?" he said. He was aware this was what Caroline had said to him. He was on the other side of it now. "Yes," she said. "Do you ever perform for people? In conversation, I mean. Do you ever give people a version of yourself rather than the thing itself?" She thought about it, genuinely thought about it for long enough that he knew she was not reaching for a ready answer. Then she said, "Probably, without knowing it, I think everyone does, but I'm not very good at maintaining it. I'm too lazy. It takes too much tracking." "Tracking," he repeated. "When you perform, you have to remember what you said before. It's exhausting. I'd rather just say the thing and deal with whatever happens." He sat with this. The candle did its excessive work between them. "That sounds simple," he said. "It is simple," she said. "People make it complicated." The dinner continued. He asked about Lagos, about her family, about the work. She answered everything directly with no particular warmth or coldness, just a kind of settled evenness that he did not have a word for. She asked him about his restaurants not because she seemed particularly impressed by them, but because she was curious about the business, about the supply chains, about how a kitchen ran during service. She asked logistical questions, operational questions. No one had ever asked him operational questions on a first dinner. He found himself telling her things he did not normally tell people. Not personal things, nothing confessional, but real things, numbers, decisions he had made and their consequences. The difference between the restaurant he had wanted Maison Claire to be and what it had become. He talked about this for a few minutes and then caught himself and said, "I'm not sure why I'm telling you this." She said, "Because I asked." Which was true. Dessert, coffee, the bill which she looked at and then looked at him. "I'll get this," he said. "Thank you," she said, without protest and without performance. Just, "thank you," as though it were simply a fact, which it was. Outside, on the pavement, the air was sharp. She pulled her coat around her. He called Felix to bring a car. "I enjoyed that," she said. "It was not a performance, it was information." "So did I," he said. She looked at him for a moment. The car arrived. She got in and the door closed and the car pulled away, and he stood on the pavement outside his own restaurant in the cold, and felt something that he had not felt in 2 years. He did not know what it was. He went back inside. He sat at the corner table. Felix brought him the glass of whiskey he had not asked for but clearly needed. He sat and looked at the candle, which was doing far too many things, and he thought about the evening. He had not used a single prepared question. He had not deployed the method. He had not observed from behind the glass of his technique. He had simply sat across from a person and talked. And he had felt, for the span of about 2 hours, like himself. He did not reach for the notebook. He went home and lay on his back in the dark and stared at the ceiling and thought about the way she had said, "I'm too lazy. It takes too much tracking." He thought about what it would mean to stop tracking, to simply say the thing and deal with whatever happened. He had not operated that way for a very long time. He had, in fact, and this arrived in the dark like something cold and clear, never operated that way. Not since before the solicitor's office, not since Catherine. Maybe not even before. He slept eventually, briefly, and not well. In the morning, Patrick called to ask how the dinner had gone. Edouard said, "Fine." There was a pause. Patrick, who had known him for 15 years, said, "That's interesting." "What is?" "You said fine," Patrick said. "You never say fine. You usually say something precise." Edouard thought about this. "She's interesting," he said. "I told you she was," Patrick said, with the satisfied tone of a man who has been right. Edouard put the phone down and stood at his kitchen counter with his coffee and thought, yes. She was interesting. The question was what he was going to do about that. He called Felix and asked about the Thursday corner table. It was available, Felix said. Good, Edouard said. He had not invited a woman to a second dinner in 2 years. 3 weeks passed in which Edouard Valcourt did something he had not done in 2 years. He thought about someone after the dinner was finished. This was the problem. He was accustomed to reviewing the evenings, annotating, analyzing, moving the data point of a conversation into its appropriate column in his system of understanding. That was thinking about people. But what he was doing with Marguerite was different. He was not analyzing her. He was simply finding her present in his mind during moments that had nothing to do with analysis, during meetings, during kitchen reviews at Maison Claire, during the long drive to his supplier in the Cotswolds on a Tuesday afternoon when the road was empty and the hedges were blurred by light. He would be thinking about something practical and then, without invitation, a phrase she had said would surface. "The work is just the address," or "I'm too lazy, it takes too much tracking." He invited her to a second dinner. She said yes simply by reply message, no ceremony. They met at a small Japanese restaurant near Waterloo that he liked for its quiet. She wore something plain and dark and looked around at the low-lit space and said, "This one's better." "Better than the Candle," he said. "The Candle was trying to be 2 restaurants at once," she said. "This one knows what it is." He thought briefly that he should write that down. He did not have the notebook. The second dinner was different from the first in a way he could not cleanly describe. The first had been new. He had been mapping new territory, establishing whether she was what the first meeting had suggested. The second was something else. It was more settled. She arrived without the freshness of unfamiliarity but also without effort. She was simply there, the same person as before without performance. He asked about the South Bank project. She described a structural argument she was having with the lead engineer over a particular transition in the building's internal volumes. She used her hands when she explained. She did not check whether he was following. She assumed he was and adjusted when she saw he was not and did not make a production of either. "Who's going to win the argument?" he asked. "I am," she said, "because I'm right." "Then that sounds arrogant." "Does it?" "I know it does," she said. "But I've run the numbers 3 ways, the engineer hasn't. He's going on instinct, and instinct is useful until you check it against the numbers, and then it's just habit." He said, "Do you prefer numbers to instinct?" She considered this seriously. "I prefer the combination," she said, "but if I had to choose, I'd choose the numbers. You can be wrong about a feeling in a way you can't be wrong about mathematics. The feeling will tell you you're right until the ceiling comes down." The ceiling comes down. He thought about the solicitor's office. He thought about the notebook. "What if the numbers are built on false information?" he said. She looked at him. "Then you don't have a numbers problem," she said. "You have an information problem." He sat with this for a moment. "How do you protect against that?" "You can't protect against everything," she said. "You can make it harder for bad information to get in. You can be rigorous about sources. You can ask uncomfortable questions, but at some point you have to operate on what you have." She paused. "Otherwise you just sit there doing nothing forever." He looked at her. Something in that sentence was aimed at him with more accuracy than she could possibly have intended. They stayed at the restaurant until it was nearly 11. She told him about a project in Nairobi she had worked on before London. a community building where the original budget was a third of what the project eventually needed, and how the team had solved every problem by removing their assumptions about what was essential and starting from what was real. She talked about this at some length, and he listened properly, without the observation running underneath, and he realized that what he was doing was genuinely listening, not as a method, not as a strategy, but because he wanted to know what she said next. He could not remember the last time he had wanted to know what someone said next. Outside the restaurant, rain had started. She had no umbrella, he had a car. He offered to take her north, where she was staying in a borrowed flat near Primrose Hill. She got in without fuss. They drove through the rain and the wet streets. She looked out the window. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You keep asking me if you can ask me things," she said. "You don't need permission." "How do you decide when to trust someone?" he said. She was quiet for a moment. The car moved through a junction, amber light across the rain-wet road. "I pay attention to the gap," she said. "What gap?" "Between what they say and how they behave," she said. "Not in a paranoid way, just whether those two things are consistent over time. It takes time to see, you can't rush it." He said, "What if the time runs out before you see clearly?" She turned to look at him. "Then you make the best choice you can with incomplete information," she said. "Same as always." The car stopped outside a building near the hill. She gathered her bag and looked at him. "That was a very serious conversation for a Wednesday," she said. "You started it," he said. "I did not," she said, but she was almost smiling. She got out. He watched the building door close behind her. He asked the driver to go back toward Kensington. He sat in the back in the dark and the rain, and he thought, "I pay attention to the gap." He thought about 30 women, and the gap between what he had been observing and what had been actually happening. He had been watching for falseness so intently that he had not considered whether his own framework, the notebook, the questions, the method, was itself a kind of falseness, a construction, a ceiling built on bad information. He got home and stood in the hallway and looked at the bookshelf where the notebook sat. He did not touch it. He went to bed and lay in the dark, and thought, with uncomfortable clarity, that Marguerite had told him something important without knowing she was telling him anything at all. He was going to have to think about that. He gave himself 3 days. Then he called Patrick and said, "Tell me something about Marguerite." Patrick said, "What do you want to know?" "What's she like?" Edward said, "Not her work, her." Patrick was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Why are you asking me when you've had dinner with her twice?" "Because I want to know what someone who's known her longer thinks," Edward said. Patrick said, "She says what she means. It's unusual enough that people sometimes find it uncomfortable." A pause. "Is she making you uncomfortable?" "No," Edward said. This was not quite true. What she was doing was something different from making him uncomfortable. She was making him honest, without trying, without pointing at him or questioning him or suggesting that something was wrong. Simply by being completely herself, she was making the architecture of his own behavior visible in a way it had not been before. He thought about this for the rest of the day. He decided to invite her to a third evening. Not at a restaurant this time. She had mentioned, in passing, that she was trying to see the Soane Museum before she left London. He found that it had evening openings by appointment. He arranged one. He sent her a message. She replied, "That's the second best thing anyone has arranged for me in London." He replied, "What was the first?" She said, "A very good Ethiopian restaurant in Peckham. I'll tell you about it." He read this and felt something shift in him that he recognized, after a moment, as something close to anticipation. He could not remember the last time he had felt anticipation. That, he thought, was probably something he needed to pay attention to. The Soane Museum evening arrived. They walked through the rooms with a guide who knew the collection in detail. Marguerite asked the guide 3 questions that the guide visibly found interesting. She examined a drawing by Piranesi for a long time and said nothing. She stood in the picture room and looked at the layers of paintings hinged on the walls and said, "This is the most intelligent use of space I've seen in London." He stood beside her and looked at the layers opening out and thought that this was, in fact, what she had done to him. Opened panels he had closed, shown him the room behind the room. She did not know she had done this. He was not ready to tell her. But he was closer than he had been. They had dinner afterward at the Ethiopian place in Peckham, which she navigated without a map, and which turned out to be everything she had promised. They sat at a low table and ate with their hands, and she told him about a semester she had spent in Addis Ababa during her training, and he told her genuinely, without method, about the year after his father died when he had run the restaurant alone and nearly lost it, and what that had taught him about stubbornness versus actual clarity. He had never told anyone that. She listened. She did not fill the space with comfort or consolation. She just listened, which was what he had been doing to people for 2 years, and now he understood from the other side how extraordinary it was. "You learned something from losing nearly," she said. "I learned I was mistaking persistence for intelligence," he said. "They're not the same." She nodded. "Lots of people never learn that," she said. He looked at her across the low table, the shared plate between them. "I'm still learning things I should have known by now," he said, and he meant more than he said, and she heard more than he said, and they both left it there. That was the 3rd evening. He drove home and stood in the hall again. The notebook sat on the shelf. He was beginning to understand that the thing he should be writing in it was nothing about any woman he had ever had dinner with. It was something about himself. He just was not quite ready yet. But Marguerite was patient in the way of people who are genuinely interested but not anxious. She was not waiting for him to arrive anywhere. She was just there. And that, he was beginning to understand, was exactly the problem. Because it meant she was real. And real was the one thing he had spent 2 years convincing himself did not exist. 4 evenings in, and Edouard Valcourt had stopped counting. This was significant. He had counted everything: 30 women, 2 years, the number of questions he deployed per dinner, the approximate point in the evening at which each one showed him what she was hiding. Counting was how he organized the world. Counting was distance, and distance was safe. He had stopped counting with Marguerite, and he did not know exactly when it had happened. The 4th evening was not at a restaurant. She had asked plainly whether he would like to see what she was working on at the South Bank. He had said yes. They met at the site on a Thursday evening when the crew had left, and the building was empty, a vast, partially stripped space of raw concrete, and scaffold and daylight coming in through openings that were not yet windows. She walked him through the space with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what they were standing inside. She had a rolled set of drawings under her arm, and she unrolled them at various points to show him where the walls would come, where the light would fall at different times of year, what the transition between 2 volumes felt like when it was resolved correctly versus what it felt like now, unresolved. "You can feel it," she said, standing at the boundary between 2 sections of the floor. "Even with nothing here, you can feel where it's wrong. There's too much competition between the spaces. They're arguing with each other." He stood where she stood and looked at the empty space and felt something. Whether he was feeling what she was describing, or whether he was simply feeling the effect of standing in a large, unfinished building at dusk with her, he was not certain. He suspected the line between those 2 things was thinner than he might have thought. "And when it's resolved," he said. "You'll walk through and feel one thing," she said, "not 5 things, one." He thought, "I have been feeling 5 things for 2 years. He did not say this. She walked him to a section near the northern end of the building where a specific problem was still unsettled, a junction between old brickwork and new steel, 2 materials that needed to be joined in a way that acknowledged both without either dominating. She explained the engineering constraints. She explained what she wanted to achieve. She said, "I haven't solved it yet." "What does that feel like?" he asked. She thought about it. "Like a word you know but can't find," she said. "You know it exists, you know what it means, it's right there, you just can't reach it yet." He understood this. He had been reaching for a word for 2 years, he had not found it. They left the building when the light had mostly gone. She rolled her drawings, he held the door. Outside, the river was dark and moving. "Thank you for showing me," he said. "I wanted you to see it," she said. "I don't usually bring people in." He looked at her. "Why did you bring me?" She thought about it. "Because I thought you'd actually look," she said. "Most people walk through and see the mess. They can't see past what's in front of them to what's coming." He held this for a moment. He was not sure it was only about the building. They walked along the river. She asked about his foundation, the culinary training program, what it actually produced for the people who went through it. He told her about a young man named Daniel who had come through at 19 with no training and no real direction, who was now running the kitchen at a restaurant in Bristol. She asked specific questions about the program structure. He answered them. "You care about that more than the restaurants," she said. It was not a question. He paused. "Is it that obvious?" "You talk about the restaurants like business," she said. "You talk about the foundation like something that matters." He was quiet. "The restaurants matter," he said. "I know," she said, "but differently." He did not argue. She was right. They found a place with coffee and sat by the window looking at the river. She wrapped her hands around her cup. He looked at his. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to tell me if it's an odd question." "Everything you ask is somewhat odd," she said. "Ask." He looked at her. "When was the last time someone completely surprised you? Not pleasantly, not unpleasantly, just wrong-footed you in a way you didn't see coming." She was quiet. The river moved outside the window. "About 3 years ago," she said. "Someone I trusted for a long time showed me they were a different person than I thought. Not dramatically, just consistently over time the real person surfaced, and I realized I'd been filling in the gaps with who I wanted them to be." He sat very still. "What did you do?" he said. "I stopped filling in the gaps," she said. "I started looking at what was actually there." He looked at the table. He thought about the notebook. He thought about 30 women and all the verdicts he had written beside their names. He thought about whether the verdicts had been observations or whether they had been gaps. Whether he had been filling in the gaps not with who he wanted them to be, but with who he expected them to be, which was its own kind of distortion, possibly worse. "That must have been hard," he said. "It was," she said, "and then it wasn't, because at least what was left was real." He looked at her. She was looking at the river. She was not performing equanimity. She simply had it, the settled kind, the kind that comes not from the absence of difficulty but from having passed through it and come out the other side. He wanted to ask her, does it come back, the trust, does it repair? He did not ask it because he was not ready for the answer in front of another person. He asked it to himself, quietly, on the drive home. He did not have an answer. But the question was alive in him in a way questions had not been for a long time, not the sharp, controlled questions he had used across 30 dinner tables. A different kind of question, the kind that sat at the center of things. The driver took him home. He stood in the hall, the notebook. He reached for it. He opened it for the first time in weeks. He read from the beginning, from the first entry from woman number 1, all the way through to Caroline at number 30. He read slowly, his annotations, his verdicts, his careful record of everything he had observed. He read it, and something happened that he had not expected. He felt, reading it, enormous regret. Not about the method, not about the observation, but about all the real things he had probably missed while he was looking for the false ones. 7 of these women, at least 7, he thought, maybe more, had been genuinely interested in him. In him, not the him that deployed questions and maintained composure and kept the notebook in his pocket like a small, secret shield, but in whatever he was underneath that, which was something he had not shown anyone in 2 years. The Scottish teacher whose laugh was too loud. He sat with the notebook open in his lap, and the stillness of the house around him, and he thought, I have been so busy being defended that I forgot what I was defending. He closed the notebook. He thought about Marguerite. She was not filling in the gaps. She was looking at what was actually there. He had felt this from the beginning, the sense that she saw him with an accuracy that bypassed his usual management of being seen. It was not comfortable. It was also, and this was the word he had been looking for, it was also honest. Not her honesty, his, the honesty she seemed to make possible in him simply by not requiring anything else. He went to bed. He did not sleep immediately. He lay on his back and thought about the space in the building where the 2 volumes argued with each other and imagined what it would feel like when they were resolved. 1 thing she had said, not 5 things, 1. He was still feeling 5 things. But for the first time in a long time, he thought he could see them clearly. In the morning, he sent her a message. It was a short message. It said, I'd like to see you again. No event, just dinner. She replied, yes. Just that, yes. He put his phone down and stood at the kitchen window and allowed himself quietly to understand that something had changed. He was not sure what it had changed into. He was not sure where it was going. He was sure, for the first time in 2 years, that he was present enough to find out. Which was, he thought, already more than he had expected. He arrived at the restaurant before her, which had always been his habit, but that evening he was not using the early minutes to position himself. He was simply early. He sat at a table near the window, not the corner table, a different one, facing out rather than in, and he watched the street. She arrived exactly on time. She walked in and saw him and came to the table and said, "You're facing the wrong direction." "I know," he said. She sat down, she looked at the street for a moment, then back at him. "You look different," she said. "Do I?" "Something," she said. She did not labor it. The waiter came, they ordered. She had been at the site all day, a difficult meeting with the planning authority over a detail that should have been settled months ago. She described the meeting with dry precision. The two officials who had contradicted each other without either noticing, the engineer who had arrived with the wrong set of drawings, the hour she had spent essentially resolving someone else's preparation failure so that the actual work of the meeting could happen. "Were you angry?" he asked. "During," she said. "Afterward, no. Anger during is useful, afterward it's just wearing." He asked what useful anger felt like, from the inside. She looked at him, focused, she said. "Clear, you stop thinking about everything except the actual problem, it strips away the noise." He thought about his own anger, the anger that had started in the solicitor's office in Holborn and had never fully discharged, the anger that had quietly shaped 2 years of careful dinner conversations without him ever naming it anger. He had called it research. He had called it observation. He had called it a project. "What do you do when the anger isn't about a problem you can solve?" he said. She thought about this. "Find something small that you can actually fix," she said. "Even something completely unrelated. It's not a solution, but it's a reset." He said, "What if you've been angry for a long time, and it's become so familiar you stopped feeling it as anger?" She looked at him. This was a different kind of look from her usual directness. More careful, not probing, attentive. "That happens," she said. "It becomes the background. You stop noticing it because it's always there." "And then," he said. "And then something changes," she said, "and you notice the background for the first time because it suddenly shifts." A pause. Has something shifted? He looked at her. He had been deciding for 2 weeks how much to tell her and in what order. He had planned sentences. He had considered approaches. He had, in fact, fallen back on something very like his old habit of preparation. And sitting across from her now, with the street behind her and the wine between them and her direct attention on him, he discarded all of it. "I should tell you something," he said. "All right," she said. He told her about Catherine, the gala, the conversation, the trust that had felt so completely grounded, the solicitor's office, the £430,000 that had evaporated. He told it without drama, in the plain form of what had happened. He watched her face as he spoke and saw no reaction except attention, genuine, still, unperforming attention. "I'm sorry that happened," she said. Not, "That's awful, how terrible, you must have been devastated," just, "I'm sorry that happened." Factual, present. "After that," he said, "I started a project." He described the project, all of it. The decision, the method, the notebook, the questions, the 2 years, the 30 women. He described it as clearly as he could. He did not soften it or position it as something more defensible than it was. When he finished, she was quiet. He waited. He had not known until this moment how much her response mattered to him. She said, "Was it useful?" He had not expected that. "What?" "Did you find what you were looking for?" she said. "No," he said. She nodded. "What were you looking for?" He opened his mouth. He closed it. He tried again. "I thought I was looking for the mechanism of it, how a person deceives someone, how it works. How you miss it." "But," he looked at the table. "I think I was looking for something to confirm what I already believed," he said. "That people show you a false version of themselves, that the false version is the point of them." "And did you confirm it?" she said. "I confirmed it enough to keep going," he said, "which isn't the same thing." She was quiet. The restaurant moved around them unhurried. "What did you actually find?" she said. "That I'm very good at seeing what I'm looking for," he said, "which means I was probably missing everything else." She looked at him. "That's an honest thing to say," she said. "It took me a while," he said. "It usually does," she said, And she did not say this with any condescension. She said it with the simple acknowledgement of someone who has also taken a while at things. The food arrived, they ate. He felt the particular relief of having said the most difficult thing and found it received plainly, without theater, without withdrawal. "Can I ask you one more thing?" he said. "You don't need permission," she said again, for the second time. He was beginning to understand this was her way of telling him she was not keeping score. "Did you know," he said, "that something was off in the evenings, the way I asked things?" She considered this honestly. "I knew you were working at something," she said. "You're careful in a way that costs something, you can see the effort slightly, but I assumed it was just how you were. Some people are very controlled in company." "I was more than controlled," he said. "I know," she said, "but you were also real in the parts that mattered, that came through as well, that's why I kept coming." He looked at her. "The notes," she said, "I noticed you didn't have them. By the second dinner, something was different." He stared at her. "The notebook." "You didn't have it," she said. "You reached into your jacket pocket twice at the first dinner and then stopped yourself. By the second dinner you'd left it somewhere." He had not known she had seen this. He had been certain his management of the evenings was invisible. "You saw that?" he said. "I pay attention," she said, and then almost to herself, though I didn't know what it meant. "I just knew the second dinner was different." He sat in this for a moment. He looked at her. "What do I do with all of it?" he said, and he meant the project, the notebook, the 30 women, the 2 years, the whole careful and defended structure of the life he had built after Holborn. She looked at him steadily. She said, "Stop doing it." He said, "Just stop." "Yes," she said, "not dramatically, just stop, and do something different instead." "Like what?" She picked up her glass. "Like having a conversation," she said, "like this one." He looked at her. He almost laughed. He did not quite, but something that was close to lightness moved through him, something that felt like the particular relief of being plainly understood. They stayed at the table for another hour. They talked about ordinary things, a film she had seen the previous weekend, a sourcing problem he was having with one of his wine suppliers, a building in Lagos that she described with the kind of love people usually reserve for people. He listened. She listened. Neither of them was performing anything. When they left, the street was cold and lit from above by a low, clouded sky. She pulled her coat close. He stood beside her and felt the city around them, ordinary and moving, and he thought, "I have been sitting in restaurants for 2 years asking questions designed to catch something, and the thing I have been looking for was never the kind of thing that could be caught." He did not say any of this. There was time. She flagged a cab. It pulled over. She opened the door and looked at him. "I'm glad you told me," she said. "So am I," he said. She got in. The cab moved away. He stood on the pavement and did not reach for the notebook in his pocket, because the notebook was not there and had not been there for several weeks, and this felt, for the first time, like a decision rather than an oversight. He walked home. The night was cold and the city was loud, and he walked through all of it without observation and without annotation and without method. And by the time he reached his door, he was simply a man who had told someone the truth and had not lost anything in the telling. He stood on his doorstep for a moment. Then he went inside. He passed the bookshelf in the hall without stopping. For once in 2 years, he did not look at the notebook. 6 days later, he did something he had been not doing for 8 years. He called his mother. Her name was Celestine. She lived in a large house in the French countryside outside of Lyon that she had occupied alone since Edouard's father, Philip, had died 17 years ago. She was 71. She grew roses in the garden and read history and called Edouard on his birthday and at Christmas, and he received these calls with warmth and correct feeling and then did not call her back. He had told himself many stories about why he did not call back. He was busy. He was not good at telephone conversations. The time difference was difficult, though it was only an hour, and this was not a serious obstacle, and he knew it. The real reason was simpler and more uncomfortable. He did not call because the last real conversation he had with Celestine, not the birthday calls, not the Christmas warmth, but the last genuine exchange that had cost them both something, had taken place 33 years ago, when he was 14 years old, and it had ended with something she said that had lodged in him like a piece of glass, invisible but present, turning on its edge whenever he moved in a particular direction. He was not, in his adult life, a person who thought of himself as shaped by a single sentence. He had been, until recently, the kind of man who found psychological tidiness slightly suspicious. The idea that one thing said by one person at one moment could create the structure of a life. He had found this too convenient, too clean. He had seen people use the story of a wound to avoid the responsibility of the life they were living, and he had resolved not to be that person. And then, sitting in his study 3 nights ago, he had read the notebook from the first entry to the last, and he had known, with the clarity that came from finally not looking away from something, that his 30 dinner tables and his sharp questions and his 2-year project of systematic suspicion had not begun in a solicitor's office in Holborn. They had begun on an afternoon in March, 33 years ago, in the sitting room of the Lyon House, when Celestine had said, "You are your father's child, and the person who says the right thing is rarely the person who does it." She had said this about someone else, a situation he barely remembered now, a neighbor, a local dispute. She had not been speaking to him exactly. He had been in the room but not the subject. But he had heard it and kept it. "You are your father's child, and the person who says the right thing is rarely the person who does it." He had understood this at 14, and had understood it in a way that children understand things they have not yet earned, which is to say, completely and permanently, before they have the context to know what to do with it. He had understood it as a statement about people, about what people were. He now understood, spent 33 years organizing evidence to confirm that his mother had been right. He sat at the kitchen counter in the morning with his coffee and the phone on the surface in front of him, and he thought about this for a long time. He thought about whether calling her would change anything, whether the conversation would help or simply unsettle them both without resolution. He thought about what he would say. He thought about what she was likely to say. Then he stopped thinking and picked up the phone and called. It rang 4 times. He was almost relieved. Then she answered. "Edouard," she said. Her voice was the same. Older slightly, but the same, the particular quality of it that had always been both warm and contained, like heat held behind glass. "Hello, Mammon," he said. "This is unexpected," she said. "Yes," he said. A pause. She waited. This was also the same. Celestine had always been willing to wait. He had sometimes thought this was patience. He now thought it was something more deliberate, a choice to hold space until the person in front of her was ready to occupy it. "I've been thinking about something," he said, "about a conversation a long time ago." She was quiet. "You said something when I was 14, he said, "about Philip, and about people saying things they don't do." A pause. "I say many things," she said carefully. "I know," he said. "This one stayed." Another pause. Longer. He heard her breathing. He heard, distantly, the wind through whatever window she had opened in Lyon. "Which part?" she said. "That the person who says the right thing rarely does it," he said. "I think I took it as a general truth, about everyone." He heard her release a breath. "I was angry when I said that," she said, "at your father, not at people in general." "I know," he said, "but I was 14. She was quiet for a long time. "I said too many things about your father when you were young," she said. "Some of them were true and some of them were true but not meant to be carried." A pause. "I am sorry for the ones that were not meant to be carried." He sat at the counter. The coffee was cold. The garden window was bright. "Did you believe it?" he said. "The general version of it, that people don't mean what they say." She thought about this with the seriousness he remembered, the refusal to give a quick answer. "I believed it about your father for a long time," she said. "And then I got older and I was fairer to him finally in my thinking. He was not dishonest. He was complicated. There is a difference." "I didn't know the difference at 14, Edouard said. "No," she said, "you wouldn't." He sat in the kitchen. The light moved slightly through the window. "I've been using it," he said, "the belief for a long time without knowing I was using it." "What did you use it for?" she said. He told her, not everything, not the 30 women, not the notebook, but the shape of it, the project. The 2 years of careful observation. The way he had organized his interactions around looking for the falseness that he had come to believe was at the center of every person. He told her this plainly, the way he had told Marguerite, which was without managing her response. Celestine was quiet throughout. When he finished, she said, "And did you find it, the falseness?" "Sometimes," he said, but I think I was finding it because I was looking for it, which is not the same as it actually being there. No, she said, it is not the same. A pause, he said, I did not become Philip. The silence that followed this sentence was enormous. He had not planned to say it. It had come out of some place beneath the prepared words, the rehearsed approach, the managed telling. It had come out simply because it was the thing. He heard his mother make a sound that was not quite a word. He said, I think I was so determined not to be him, not to be someone who said one thing and did another, that I stopped saying anything real at all. Another silence. Philip was not a dishonest man, Celestine said. Her voice was careful, deliberate. He was a man who was afraid of disappointment and found it easier to promise than to deliver. That is not the same as a liar. I was too hard on him when you were young, and you were in the room. He did not speak. I am sorry, she said, for what you were carrying without knowing what it was. He held the phone. Outside, a bird was doing something complicated in the garden hedge. It's all right, he said. It is not entirely all right, she said, but it is not entirely your fault either. These things are complicated. He almost smiled. I'm beginning to think more things are complicated than I gave them credit for, he said. That is a useful thing to begin thinking, she said. They talked for another 20 minutes, not about the important things those had been said. They talked about the house, the garden, whether he was going to come to Lyon before the year ended. She told him about a rose she had been cultivating for 3 years that had finally produced something extraordinary. He told her about the foundation, about Daniel in Bristol, about the way a restaurant kitchen smells in the early morning before service. When they hung up, he sat at the counter for a long time. He thought about his father, Philip, who he had last seen at the age of 32, 2 years before Philip died, and who he had kept at a careful distance for most of his adult life for reasons he had never directly examined. He thought about Philip with something new, something that was not quite forgiveness because forgiveness implied a court and a verdict, and what he now thought was that there had been no verdict required. Only a complicated man, and a boy in a room who had picked up the wrong piece of information and built a world out of it. He stood up. He went to the bookshelf in the hall. He took down the notebook. He opened it to the last page, which was the page he had left blank for 33 years, the page beside his mother's name. He sat down at the desk. He thought about what to write. He wrote, she was afraid too. He looked at it. Then he wrote, so was I. He closed the notebook. He did not put it back on the shelf. He held it for a moment and then set it on the desk, which was different from the shelf, though he could not have explained exactly why it felt different. It just did. He went to make a fresh cup of coffee. He stood at the window and looked at the garden, which was just beginning to come into its spring, the first green of things that had been quietly preparing all winter. He thought, I have been carrying something cold for a very long time. He thought about Marguerite. He thought about the project, the questions, the 2 years of dinner tables. He thought about Celestine in the Lyon house with her rose that had finally, after 3 years, produced something extraordinary. He thought some things take a long time. He thought that is all right. He drank his coffee. He picked up his phone and sent a message to Marguerite. It said, I spoke to my mother today, first time in a while. It went better than expected. She replied a few minutes later, good. Just that, good. He looked at the word for a moment. Then he put the phone in his pocket and went to get ready for the day. The morning Edouard decided to tell Marguerite everything was unremarkable in every external way. He woke at his usual hour. He made coffee. He read through supplier emails at the kitchen counter. A pigeon arrived on the garden wall and left without doing anything memorable. And then he picked up the notebook from the desk where he had left it after the call with Celestine, and he read through it one more time, and when he closed it he thought, she should know. Not because he owed it to her, though in some sense he felt that he did, not as a confession or a clearing of accounts, but because she was real, and what he had been doing was real, and the gap between those two facts needed to be closed before anything else between them could be actual. He called her. She answered on the 3rd ring. He asked if she was free that evening. She said she was mostly. He said he had something he wanted to tell her properly and asked if he could come to her. A pause. He was aware this was unusual. He had never come to her. The evenings had always been neutral ground, restaurants, the museum, the riverside. Asking to come to where she was living felt like a shift in the register, and he was naming it deliberately. She said, "Of course." He went to her borrowed flat near Primrose Hill at 7:30, having walked part of the way, which he had not intended to do but which turned out to be necessary. He needed the cold and the movement. He had rehearsed nothing. He had decided, definitively, not to rehearse this. She opened the door in something comfortable and unpretentious, no ceremony about it. The flat was warm and slightly disordered with her work, drawings pinned to the wall, scale models on the table, a laptop open beside 2 mugs. The space looked lived, in by someone who was thinking in it constantly. She had made tea. She pointed at the mugs and he took one. They sat on opposite ends of the sofa. She tucked her feet up and looked at him and waited. "I told you about the project," he said, "the notebook." "Yes," she said. "I want to tell you the rest of it," he said. She nodded. He told her about Celestine, about the sentence he had heard at 14, about Philip and the story he had constructed from the material of a complicated man and a mother's anger, and one afternoon, in a room where he had been present but not addressed. He told her how this had met the experience of Catherine, the betrayal in Holborn, and had confirmed everything the 14-year-old had been quietly certain of, and how the combination of the two had produced the project. He told her this without editing it, without making himself more sympathetic or more villainous than he was. He told it the way she had taught him, without knowing she was teaching him, simply by modeling it over 5 evenings, factually directly, with the assumption that plain information was sufficient. She listened without moving. When he finished, she said, "How do you feel having told me that?" He thought about it. "Strange," he said, "and also not as bad as I expected." "It's almost always not as bad," she said, after. He looked at her. "You're not surprised," he said. "By which part?" she said. "Any of it?" She was quiet for a moment. "I thought the project was probably bigger than what you told me initially," she said. "You were too deliberate for it to just be about the one woman, the one who took your money." A pause, and the questions, the way you asked them, there was something underneath. He felt the slight humiliation of having been read, and underneath that the other thing, the relief. "You said you hadn't known what it was," he said. "I didn't know the specifics," she said, "but I knew something was being worked through." He looked at her. "You stayed anyway," he said. She looked back at him. "Yes," she said. "Why?" he said. She was quiet, not avoiding the question, simply finding the honest answer rather than the easy one. He had learned this about her. The pause meant she was working, not retreating. "Because the thing being worked through seemed worth the working," she said, "and because the person underneath it was worth knowing." He sat with this. "I need to tell you something else," he said. "All right," she said. He looked at the table, at the scale model on the surface, some piece of the South Bank project, a small replica of a complex junction in balsa wood and card. "I came to this," he said, meaning the project, the 30 dinners, the method, all of it, because I was trying to protect myself from being wrong about people the way I was wrong about Catherine. But that was the reason I told myself." He paused. "The actual reason was that I was already wrong about people. I had been wrong about people since I was 14. Catherine didn't make me suspicious, she confirmed it." Marguerite did not speak. "Which means," he said, "that none of those 30 evenings were actually research. They were just evidence collection for a verdict I had already written." She was very still. He looked at her. "I wasted 2 years," he said, "and I think I wasted some people's time in the process, women who were genuine, and I annotated them like they were specimens." She said, "Are you telling me this because you feel guilty?" "Partly," he said, "and partly because I think I owe you a clear view of the person you've been spending time with." She was quiet. She looked at her tea for a moment. She said, "The person I've been spending time with is the one who realized all of this, not just the one who did it." He looked at her. "People are both," she said. "What they did and what they understood about it afterward. You can't only be one." He sat in this. Outside, the Primrose Hill street was quiet. A car passed. The flat was warm. "There's something I want to ask you," she said, "and I want you to answer it the way you just told me all of that, without managing it." "All right," he said. She looked at him. "What do you actually want?" she said. Not from the project, not from the research, from your life now. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He had not been asked this in, he could not quantify it, a very long time. He had been asked what he was looking for in a partner, in various socially acceptable forms, across 30 dinner tables. He had answered those questions with calibrated answers. He had never been asked what he actually wanted from his life, plainly, without architecture. He said, "I want to stop being defended." She looked at him. "I want to be in a room with someone and be there," he said, "not watching, not taking notes, not waiting for the crack." He paused. "I want to trust something again." She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "You've been trusting me." He realized, with something that moved through him with considerable force, that she was right. He had been, not strategically, not as an experiment. He had been trusting her for several weeks, incrementally, without deciding to, without the notebook, without the method. He had been trusting her the way people trust things when they stop overthinking the mechanics of it, as a natural consequence of being genuinely present. He had not known he was doing it. She had been watching him do it. He looked at her and something in his chest did something that he was not going to describe to himself just yet, because he was not ready to name it, and naming it prematurely felt like the old habit, and he was trying to break the old habit. But he felt it. He said, "I've been trusting you." "Yes," she said. "And it didn't feel like anything," he said. "Not in a bad way, it felt like nothing, like ordinary. Like not having to calculate." She almost smiled. "That's what trust feels like," she said. "Not dramatic, just the absence of the other thing." He sat in the warmth of the flat and the quiet of the evening and thought, yes. The absence of the other thing. He had not known what to call the thing he had been carrying. He had called it caution, he had called it clarity, he had called it a research project. It was the absence of trust, that was all it had ever been. And in its place, in the place where the method and the notebook and the 30 annotated evenings had been, something much simpler was beginning to settle. He was not going to put a word on it tonight. Tonight he was going to sit in this flat with this woman and drink his tea and let whatever was settling settle. She refilled his mug. He said, "Thank you." She said, "You're welcome." Outside, Primrose Hill was getting on with its evening. Inside, two people who had both come through something sat side by side on a sofa and were, for the moment, entirely present. That, he thought, was enough. That was more than enough. It was, in fact, everything. The week after Edouard sat in Marguerite's flat and told her everything was the quietest week he had known in years. Not quiet in the hollow way, not the quiet of avoidance or the quiet of the person who has withdrawn into themselves and locked the door. It was a different kind of quiet, the kind that comes when the loudest noise you were carrying has finally been set down. He went to the restaurant on Monday morning and stood in the kitchen with the head chef, a meticulous man named George, and they talked through the new spring menu for 45 minutes. He listened to George's ideas without managing the conversation, without calculating what George was really saying versus what he appeared to be saying. He just listened. George noticed something was different and said nothing, which was the right call. He visited the Foundation's training kitchen on Wednesday. 4 young people were in the middle of a bread session supervised by a tutor named Helen. Edouard stood at the back and watched. A girl of about 19 was rolling dough with the kind of concentration that meant she was fighting with it, forcing it, and the tutor went over and said, "Stop trying to win. Let it come." The girl adjusted and it worked, and she looked at her hands like they had done something on their own. Edouard drove home thinking about that. Stop trying to win, let it come. He had been trying to win something for 2 years. He was not entirely sure against what. Against being fooled again, yes, that had been the starting point. But somewhere in the 2 years the project had shifted from protection into contest, and the thing he was trying to win had become something abstract and internal, something to do with being right about what people were. He had not been trying to understand people. He had been trying to beat them to the falseness before it could surprise him. He had not been able to do this with Marguerite because she was not false. She simply was not. And the system he had built to detect falseness had no response to the genuine article except to go quiet. He called Patrick on Thursday. Patrick answered with his usual absence of preamble. "How's the architect?" Patrick said. "She's well," Edouard said. You sound different, Patrick said. People keep saying that, Edward said. That's because you are, Patrick said. Whatever she did, keep it up. Then what did she do? Nothing, Edward said. That was the thing. Patrick was quiet for a moment. That is either the most or the least interesting thing you've ever said to me, he said. Yes, Edward said. He went to see Marguerite on Friday. They had not planned something elaborate. She had another late meeting at the South Bank site, and he brought food to the borrowed flat, and they ate at her work table with the drawings around them, and she told him about the structural problem that had been solved, finally, 2 days earlier. The 2 volumes had stopped arguing. The engineer had come around. She described the moment she had walked through the resolved space and felt it work, the first time, and her face changed when she described it in a way that he recognized. It was the way a person's face changes when they are talking about the thing they love. He thought, I have not talked about anything the way she talks about buildings. He had not known what he loved in that frank, undefended way for a long time. He had loved efficiency. He had loved method. He had loved the satisfaction of a correctly observed pattern. He had loved the foundation's work, which was the closest thing to genuine feeling he had allowed himself. But he had not loved a thing the way she loved a solved building. He was not sure yet what he loved that way. He was thinking about it. After they ate, she pushed the drawings to one side and looked at him and said, What are you going to do with the notebook? He had thought about this. I don't know, he said. I can't throw it away. Why not, she said, not challenging, asking. Because it happened, he said. Those 30 people are real, I can't unmake it. She nodded. What do you think about when you think about it, she said. He thought about the question. Helen, he said. Which one is Helen? 22nd, he said, and then, aware of how this sounded, she said something to me that I didn't know what to do with at the time. She said I was the most interesting man she'd ever been bored by. Marguerite looked at him. What did she mean? I think she meant that I was engaged and skilled and present in a way that should have been interesting but wasn't, because none of it was actually pointed at her. It was pointed inward, at my system. She was quiet. I'd like to apologize to her, he said. Not formally, but somehow. You should, she said. I don't know how, he said. You start with sorry and you say the rest honestly, she said. The same way you told me. He looked at her. He thought about this. He thought about whether it was the right thing to do, whether going back to any of the 30 would be helpful or intrusive, whether the apology was for them or for him. Is it for me, he said, asking himself as much as her. She looked at him. Probably both, she said. Apologies usually are, that doesn't make them wrong. He sat with this. She went back to her drawings. He sat at the table with the remnants of the meal between them and thought about 30 women and what a genuine apology would look like. Not a mass amendment, not a formal accounting, but for the ones who deserved it, for the ones who had been real and whom he had treated as data, some acknowledgement. He thought about the Scottish teacher. He could not remember her last name, which said something. He thought about Helen. He thought about woman number 7 who had cried at the table and apologized for it, and whom he had told, honestly, that there was nothing to apologize for, but who he had then written about in the notebook as displaying emotion strategically. She had not been displaying anything strategically. She had simply been a person having a hard moment in the company of someone she hoped might be kind. He had been kind in the moment. He had also been observing. He thought the 2 things can coexist and both can be true, and one of them is still wrong. Marguerite had finished her section of the drawing and was looking at something on her laptop. She was not performing being comfortable in his company. She was comfortable in his company. He was comfortable in hers. This was the thing that had crept up on him over 5 weeks without announcement, the simple, unseized fact of comfort. He had not been comfortable with anyone for 2 years. He said, Can I ask you something? She looked up. Always, she said. She had stopped saying you don't need permission, he noticed, and had moved on to always. The word was different. He was not going to annotate it, but he noticed it. What did you think of me, he said. Early on, the first dinner, what was your actual first impression? She thought about it. Controlled, she said. Precise, interesting, but working hard to keep that in check, like you were rationing it. Good questions that you already knew the shape of before you asked them. She paused, and underneath that something else that I couldn't name. What do you call it now, he said, now that you know more? She looked at him. Grief, she said. He was very still. Not fresh grief, she said. Old grief. The kind that's been rerouted through something else and is no longer called grief at all. It was running underneath everything. All the control and the method, that was the shape of grief that didn't have anywhere to go. He sat in the flat with the drawings on the wall and the city outside, and the woman across the table who had just said the word he had been walking around for 2 years without entering, and he felt something in his chest go quiet. Not empty, quiet. Like a sound that has been constant and has finally stopped, and you only now understand how much noise it was. Yes, he said. Just that. She nodded. She did not push further. She did not elaborate. She let the word sit between them and be what it was. He was grateful for this, in a way he did not have language for. He stood up a while later to help clear the table. She washed and he dried, and they stood at the kitchen sink in the borrowed flat in Primrose Hill, and it was ordinary and unremarkable and the most comfortable he had been in a room in years, and he thought, this is what the thing resolves into. Not drama, not revelation, not the dramatic overturning of everything. Just this, someone at the sink, someone beside them, a dishcloth. The ordinary warmth of being neither alone nor defended. He drove home late. The city was quieter than usual, or he was more attuned to its quietness. He passed a restaurant he had been to with woman number 12, the one with the loud laugh, and he made a note, not in the notebook, in his mind, to look her up, to find some way to say the thing. He got home and stood in the hall. He looked at the shelf. The notebook was on the desk where he had left it after the phone call with Celestine. He picked it up. He carried it to the desk and sat down. He opened it to the last page. The 2 lines he had written were there. She was afraid too, so was I. He read them. He wrote one more line. I am going to stop being. He looked at this for a moment. Then he crossed out the last 3 words and wrote instead, I am going to start. He closed the notebook. He put it in the desk drawer, not the shelf, the drawer. And then Edouard Valcourt, who had spent 2 years and 2 months building walls out of questions, sat at his desk in the quiet of the night and felt, for the first time in a very long time, the extraordinary and simple weight of having somewhere to go. Edouard did not plan the last dinner. This was the thing he thought about afterward, that it arrived without architecture, without a prepared table or a reserved corner or a question shaped for its occasion. It arrived on a Tuesday, which was not a meaningful day, in a restaurant neither of them had chosen deliberately but had walked past on the way back from the Southbank site, and he had said, this looks good. She had said, yes, so they went in. It was a small Italian place that had been open, the waiter told them, for 34 years. The walls were plain. The tables were close together. An older couple nearby were sharing a single dessert and not speaking, which was not the silence of estrangement but the silence of people who had said everything to each other at some point and were now simply together in the world. Edouard looked at the couple and then looked away. Marguerite was studying the menu. She ordered pasta. He ordered something with fish. The waiter brought bread. They had been seeing each other for 7 weeks if you counted from the first dinner. He did not particularly want to count. He was aware this was new for him. He had counted everything for 2 years, and the not counting felt like a small, continuous exercise in the thing he was trying to do, which was to let things be what they were rather than what they measured. The problem at the site is resolved, she said. Finally, we signed off on the transition today. How does it feel? He said. Good, she said. Mostly I feel finished with it and ready for the next problem. He smiled. You have a very short celebration window. Celebrations are for after everything is done, she said. This is one part of a larger thing. You don't celebrate solving one sentence in a paragraph. He looked at her. When is the whole thing done? 8 months, she said, give or take. He did the arithmetic without wanting to. 8 months from now was December. Her contract in London was 6 months. December was outside the contract. She watched him do the arithmetic. She was, he had learned, good at watching people without appearing to watch them. A professional skill, possibly, from years of reading spaces and understanding what was in them before anyone said a word. I've been offered an extension, she said. He looked at her. She had said this so evenly that he could not read it as either significant or casual, and he had stopped trying to read her voice for content that she was not openly giving him. If it was significant, she would say, Is that something you want? He said. I'm thinking about it, she said. I haven't decided. He nodded. He did not fill the space with what he wanted her to decide. He was aware he had a preference. He was also aware that her life was arranged around the work, that she had told him clearly at the beginning that she followed the work, and that this was not a negotiating position but a fundamental fact about who she was. He respected this. He also quietly hoped the extension was something she wanted for her own reasons. He said, "What would you do there? In Lagos if you went back on schedule?" She described a project she had been circling for 2 years, a community space in a neighborhood on the eastern side of the city, underfunded, years from resolution, but architecturally one of the most interesting briefs she had seen. She described it with the particular energy she brought to things that mattered, and he listened. "That sounds like the work you actually want to be doing," he said. "It is," she said. "London is good, but Lagos is where I need to be building." He looked at his glass. He looked at the couple in the corner, the shared dessert, the settled silence. He said, "I've been thinking about the foundation." She looked at him. He had not told her what he had been thinking, so she waited. "There are culinary training programs in several cities," he said. "The model works. I've been approached twice about establishing something in Lagos, a hospitality and culinary training program connected to one of the universities there." He paused. "I've said no both times because I wasn't sure I had the capacity to oversee it properly." She was very still. "And now," she said, "I'm reconsidering the capacity question," he said. She looked at him for a long time. He met her eyes. He was clear about this with himself, proposing that she was the reason. He was not constructing a plan around her. He had been genuinely asked twice about Lagos, and both times the obstacle had been real. He did not have the infrastructure, the local knowledge, the sustained attention that a new program in a different country required. These were practical problems. But they were also problems he could work on. He had worked on harder things. And somewhere in the 7 weeks of dinners, and the South Bank, and the Soane Museum, and the flat in Primrose Hill, and the very ordinary Italian restaurant on this unremarkable Tuesday, the idea of solving those practical problems had become interesting to him in a way it had not been before. He was not going to tell her this was because of her. It would not be quite true. It was because of him, because of who he had become in the course of knowing her, which was something different. "That would be a serious undertaking," she said. "Yes," he said. "You would need good partners on the ground," she said, "people who know the city." "Yes," he said. "I could give you some names," she said, "if you decide to pursue it." He looked at her. He said, "I'd like that." She nodded, and they ate, and the pasta arrived and the fish arrived, and the couple in the corner finished their single dessert, and the woman laughed at something, and the man looked pleased, and the restaurant moved around them in its ordinary Tuesday way. He thought about the notebook. He thought about 30 women and what he had been doing and what it had cost and what it had eventually produced, which was not the pattern of human falseness he had set out to map but something he had not expected and could not have planned for, the shape of his own life, visible to him for the first time. He had been so busy annotating everyone else that he had not looked at himself. He had looked at himself now. He was not satisfied with everything he saw. Some of it required repair. Some of the repair was underway. Some of it would take time. But he could see it. He picked up his glass. He said, "I want to tell you something." She put her fork down and gave him her attention in the complete way she had, no performance, no management, just presence. He said, "I've been looking for a word for what the project was actually about, not what I said it was about, what it was." She waited. He said, "I think the word is longing." She was very still. He said, "I was not looking for the mechanism of deception. I was looking for a reason to believe it wouldn't happen. I was asking the same question 30 times and calling it research, and what I was actually asking was, is it safe? Is it safe to trust someone? And I was asking it in a way that guaranteed the answer would always be no, because you can't find safety through suspicion. You can only find more suspicion." She was quiet. He said, "You were the 31st. She looked at him. He said, "You didn't answer the question I was asking. You just were yourself." And that turned out to be the only answer that worked. She sat with this for a moment. He watched her take it in without rush, without performance of being moved or not moved, just the real thing at whatever temperature it actually arrived. She said, "I'm glad I sat down at that table." He said, "So am I." She said, "Even with the candle doing too many things." He laughed, properly, fully, the involuntary thing he had felt the first evening. She was almost smiling. The restaurant went on around them. The waiter cleared the main plates. Someone at a nearby table ordered wine and the wine arrived, and the conversation at that table got slightly louder, the good loud of people who are comfortable together. Edward sat across from Marguerite in the small Italian place on the unremarkable Tuesday and felt the kind of ordinary peace that has no drama in it, no announcement, no moment you could point to after and say, that was when everything changed. Although, of course, it had. All of it had. He had walked into Maison Claire 2 years ago carrying something he could not name and had called it research, and had sat across table after table deploying his questions like instruments. And he had thought he was protecting himself when he had actually been keeping himself in a very particular kind of cold that felt, from the inside, like clarity. And then Marguerite had sat down and told him the lighting was trying too hard, and answered the question he actually asked instead of the one she wished he had asked, and had paid attention to the gap without strategy, and had looked at him with the precision of someone who was not trying to see more than was there, but was also not willing to see less. And over 5 weeks and 7 evenings, and 1 phone call with Celestine and 1 long night with the notebook open in his lap, he had slowly, unsteadily, gratefully become someone he recognized. Not a new person, the same person, but without the armor which had been so long in place that he had forgotten what it weighed. He set down his glass. He said, "The notebook." She looked at him. He said, "I wrote something in it. The last page." She waited. "I wrote, 'I am going to start,'" he said. "I crossed out something else and wrote that." She looked at him. "Start what?" He thought about it. He had written the words as something large and undefined and felt their rightness without being able to fill them in yet. But sitting here now, in this unremarkable restaurant with this woman across from him, he thought he could answer. "Trusting the actual thing," he said, "instead of the version I expect." She was quiet. He said, not blindly, not without attention, but without the notebook. She said, "You don't need the notebook." "No," he said, "I know that now." She said, "You never did." He looked at her. He thought about Catherine. He thought about Celestine. He thought about the 14-year-old in the sitting room in Lyon who had picked up 1 sentence and built a life around its implications. He thought, "I could not have gotten here any other way." He did not say this because it was too close to the idea that the 2 years were justified, and they were not justified. They were what had happened. That was different. He said, "Thank you." She looked at him with the directness that had never varied from the first evening. "For what?" He said, "For not being false." She shook her head slightly. "I'm not particularly virtuous," she said. "I just can't maintain the alternative." "That's enough," he said. "Yes," she said, "usually it is." The dessert menu arrived. She looked at it. He looked at it. She said, "I'll have the tiramisu." He said, "Same." They ate tiramisu on a Tuesday in a restaurant that had been open for 34 years, and the older couple left and a younger couple took the same table, and the city went on outside the window, and somewhere in London 30 women were living their lives without knowing they had been part of something. And somewhere in Lyon Celestine was tending a rose that had taken 3 years to produce something extraordinary, and in a drawer in Kensington, a notebook sat with its last line. "I am going to start." He had started. He was, in fact, already well underway. He looked at Marguerite across the small table. She looked back. And that was that.